Hello, welcome to this episode of The Martial Truth, my interview with Bob Noha Sensei. Bob Noha Sensei is a longtime practitioner of Aikido, as well as several other martial arts. He's one of the authors of this new book on his Aikido sensei, Robert Nadeau. Okay, he's one of the authors of this. Excellent book. He was nice enough to send it to me. Nadeau Sensei, still alive and well, and teaching Aikido for a very long time. Studied with the founder in Japan, moved and actually lived in Japan. So Bob's going to talk a little bit about that and his own experiences, the importance of spirituality in the martial arts to him, which I thought was an interesting subject to get into a little bit. And he's been around a long time, and we hope you enjoy the podcast and the interview with him. He also is a big contributor to Masters Magazine, so you'll see many of his articles in there. He writes for them, so you can check out his writing there. As always, please click that like, share, subscribe button. Just shy of 15,500 subscribers as I film this, okay? We're up to 139 members, monthly members, which is great. So, again, let's beat that YouTube algorithm. So, nothing more to say. Here's my interview with Bob Noha Sensei. Bob Noha, welcome to the Martial Truth Podcast. And why don't you introduce yourself and give our viewers a little bit of your background, and then we'll go on from there.
Thank you very much for having me, Mike.
No problem.
So I started practicing martial arts when I was 16, which was in 1966. Initially with a Kenpo karate teacher. His name was Harvey Clary. He was a student of Ed Parker's.
Okay.
And eventually he moved to Idaho and, like yourself, became a police officer. Ended up as the chief of police in a small town in Idaho. Passed away fairly recently in his 80s.
Okay.
And initially he taught me boxing. He had been an amateur boxer in the Air Force. And then Kenpo karate. And while I was thumbing through an issue of Black Belt magazine, it had a picture of Masayama on the cover hitting a bull. I saw an ad in it for a book on Aikido. And it was a very small ad, didn't really say much about it. But something I found about it was very intriguing. So they had a directory of schools in the back of the magazine. And I contacted the school, and they directed me to the nearest school near where I live, which was in Mountain View, California, which is between San Francisco and San Jose.
Okay.
So I began studying Aikido there in November of 1966. I've been practicing continuously since then. The first two instructors I had were Sig Kufra, and he was a very senior student of Okazaki Sensei, who founded Danzan Ryu.
So let me just stop you here, because I trained with Sig Kufra. I trained with him at a couple of the Jiu-Jitsu America Danzanru camps up in I guess San Jose, is it? Santa Cruz in the early 1990s. So I got to meet him and take a few classes with him. And there's one thing he showed me that, and I'm telling you, this is still to this day. It's the way he would grip on Sankyo. And so we have that technique in Jiu-Jitsu, but I'd never gripped it like that. And he showed that grip. And to this day, when I show that technique, I still say, this guy, Sig Kufra, showed me this grip. And when I show them the grip and I do it and they feel the difference in the grip and the pain it causes, people are like, oh, and I go, because, all the other guys, I've had Aikido guys come through, other Jiu-Jitsu guys. So when I read in the book that you trained with Sig Kufra, I was like, oh, so there's another interesting link, because I still talk about him because of that specific little point he showed, but that point was a big deal. So go ahead, continue.
Well, he was very good to me as a foggy-headed 16-year-old kid that showed up at the school. The other Aikido teacher at the time, his name was Ed Riggs, and he was a retired Army officer and had studied Aikido when he was stationed in Japan. So the two of them were teaching Aikido, and the school was a combined Aikido and Danzan Ryu school.
Okay.
One night one night the other. Mostly what I learned from Sig, I didn't do that much jiu-jitsu, but Danzan Ryu, as you probably know, has a very sophisticated healing techniques in it.
Right.
And I studied a lot of those with him.
Okay. Yeah.
So shortly thereafter, Robert Nadeau, who the book is about, who had been training in Japan with the founder, returned to Northern California, which is where he was from. And he took over as chief Aikido instructor. So from that time, I began training with him and have continued training with him to this very day.
Okay. Because I didn't see that in the book. So he's still alive.
Yeah, he's going to turn 88 years old in March.
God bless him. I want to hold the book up.
Thank
So
you.
this is the book that Bob was nice enough to send me last week, which I'm working my way through. I read a good part of it, but I'm still reading it. And as I told you, I was a little surprised that I'd never heard of him. Again, though, he's a West Coast guy. I'm an East Coast guy originally. But yesterday I was doing a Zoom class with one of my most senior jiu-jitsu students who also studies Tai Chi with me. And I mentioned that I was having you on. And when I mentioned Nadeau, he goes, "Oh, I trained with him a couple of times." So it's interesting, the connections, right? So he lives in Oregon, my student. And he says, "Oh, I trained with that guy a couple of times. He came to a couple, I guess, of the Danzanru camps or whatever it was." And he said that the thing that impressed him about him was it wasn't the mamby-pamby Aikido, that when he grabbed you and did a technique on you, it was locked in. Like you didn't have a choice. You had to go. There was no playing around. It was bang, he's got you, and you're going. And he said that really impressed him about Sensei Nadeau. So go ahead, continue. And I just wanted to bring that up because again, it's all these little connections that I'm finding in the last week that we kind of have, to different instructors and some of my students that have trained with your teachers. So
One of the wonderful things about the martial arts is all the connections.
yeah.
So I trained with Nadeau Sensei through high school. I have to admit, I cut some classes in high school. He, besides his main dojo in Mountain View, his judo instructor, whose name was Moon Watanabe, had a school in Menlo Park. And my high school was in Menlo Park, which is also kind of between San Francisco and San Jose.
Okay.
So he had a noon class there. So I'd go over there for the noon class. And a lot of times I wouldn't quite make it back for my afternoon classes in high school, which didn't please my father very much, but he figured at least I wasn't out smoking dope or something like that. So when I turned 20 or 19, I guess, I'd gone to a community college, the College of San Mateo, and then I wanted to complete my education. And my parents by then had moved back to Maryland from Northern California. My father retired from the Air Force. He was a career military guy.
Okay.
World War II veteran paratrooper in World War II.
Okay.
And so he had retired. He was working as a civilian at the Pentagon. So I technically wasn't a student, a resident of California, so I couldn't go to any of the California state universities on in-state tuition, even though I'd lived there for 5 years. So I moved back to Maryland and I was a student at the University of Maryland in College Park. And so there was no Aikido in the Metro DC area at the time. This is 1970.
Okay.
So I had a letter of introduction from Nadeau Sensei to Yoshimitsu Yamada Sensei, who I know you do know.
Yeah, sure. New York Aikido.
New York.
Right.
Yes. And he and Nadeau Sensei had been longtime friends from when Yamada Sensei was a student in Japan at the same time as Nadeau Sensei.
Yeah, I saw the photos in the book. Very, it was interesting again. And I just want to mention this too, because I know Ed Hagahara also.
Yes.
So Hagahara Sensei, I was just going to say, Hagahara Sensei had an Aikido student by the name of Perry Dorch. He rented my space. And normally when a guy would rent my space, I'd do a 50-50 split because I knew how hard it was to build a class. So in Perry's case, it took him like 3 or 4 months before he got his first student. And Perry was panicking. He's like, "I'm sorry." I said, no, I understand. It takes a while. And eventually Perry built up a class and then actually left me and opened his own dojo. But the one time he said to me, he said, "Hey, could I use the space and bring my teacher in for a seminar?" I said, yeah. And he said, his name's Ed Hagahara, and he studied, he's Japanese. He studied with the founder. And I said, sure. So, Hagahara Sensei came in on Saturday afternoon. So I popped in because I wanted to meet him. I'd never met him. And so we met, and, I was in my office and I had my gun on. And his funny story, he started asking, he said, hey, which one is that? Which Glock is that? Hagahara is asking me. And so I was telling him, we're talking about guns a little bit. And again, another really, really down-to-earth, nice guy. So again, when I saw him in the book, I was like, Jesus, look at all these connections, right? Like, so it's just funny how these things work out. So go ahead, Yamada Sensei.
Well, as far as Hagihara Sensei, I never met him myself, but Nadeau Sensei used to talk about him very affectionately. And in his scrapbook of photographs, he has a picture of Hagihara Sensei at a party in Japan, wearing a lampshade on his head. So they had some fun as well as training.
Right.
So I started the school it was in Rockville, which is a suburb in the Metro DC area.
Okay.
And I taught there for 5 years under Yamada Sensei's organization. And I want to say Yamada Sensei was extremely good to me. Very, very kind, supportive. Couldn't have asked for a better person whose organization to be under. So I got out of it, and by then I graduated from college, had gone through the Air Force ROTC program, and I was serving in the Air Force and stationed most of the time at what was then Andrews Air Force Base. I think it's now called Joint Base Andrews, but
okay.
at the time it was Andrews Air Force Base. And one of the things I did there was train the military police in arrest techniques and that kind of thing.
Okay.
I was very surprised to find out that they didn't have any training in that at the time. Maybe you weren't surprised, but I was surprised.
So I'll just give you. So I even before I became a cop, I was doing some stuff with the guy that taught me jiu-jitsu was an FBI agent, and he was a supervisor. And once I became a cop, he asked me. He used to do these defensive tactics instructors classes. So they would be for local law enforcement. Group of FBI agents come in. They train them for a week, and they get certified as FBI defensive tactics instructors. So in most departments would send their defensive tactics guys. So the first he says to me, hey, could you come in and could you show some uncooperative subject handcuffing techniques? And I said, well, why do you need me to do that? And he says, well, we don't have any uncooperative subject handcuffing techniques. I said, well, everybody that you guys arrest cooperates. And he goes, well, with the FBI, we surround them with guns and they do what we say, or if anything, I said, okay, well, yes, cops can't do that. Right. And I said, most of the guys that we go to handcuff, it's not necessarily that they try to fight us, but they just won't let you put their hands behind your back. They struggle in that way. So I would come in and I would show techniques. So I did that for quite a while. And like you said, you were surprised that they didn't have these techniques. I was surprised at the time that how could the FBI not have techniques for a guy that's not cooperating? I mean, I just didn't get it. But again, operate differently. Whereas like me coming out as a transit police officer, we worked alone. So you're on solo patrol and, a lot of times you're dealing with more than one guy. You better know how to control guys because you're going to be in for a world of hurt. And the same thing with the military police. You would think if they're going in to arrest a military guy, if he's got a few in him and he decides to fight, it's not going to be an easy task. He's in good shape, right. So yeah, they need this stuff. So it's good that you started that program because again, I never understand when I hear, oh yeah, we don't train in that. We don't do that. Like, okay, all right. Makes no sense to me. So
I was very surprised too. And they were quite interested in the practices. One of the things that I had learned, Nadeau Sensei spent 4 years as a police officer
right.
in Redwood City Police Department, which is another city between San Francisco and San Jose. And he was also a weapons tactics, defensive tactics instructor when he was in the Marine Corps, a reserve. Okay. So, but I'd also studied rather extensively with Koichi Tohei Sensei.
Okay.
He was the chief instructor at the time from the world headquarters in Japan.
Right.
And he had originally been the first person to really bring Aikido into the United States, first in 1953 in Hawaii, and then kind of across the country. One interesting thing that happened to him in 1953, the judo people in America had the first U.S. judo championships at San Jose State University.
Okay.
He was at Tohei Sensei at the time was teaching in Hawaii, and the Sig Kufra was the coach for the judo team that represented Hawaii in the U.S. Judo Championships in San Jose. So they invited Tohei Sensei to come to the championships and do a demonstration. So he did. At this point, he didn't speak English. When I trained with him, his English was pretty good, actually, but this was long after that. So he did a demonstration on the second day, last day of the tournament. And the head of the Hawaiian Judo Federation, who turned out to be kind of a not very nice person, asked him if he would do a second demonstration on the last day of the tournament, and he agreed. So he walked out on the mat to do the demonstration, again, not speaking English, and this Hawaiian Judo person announced on the loudspeaker that he would take on any 5 judo guys in a no-holds-barred attack. So Sig was there and told me about it, but Bob Smith, who was my original Taiji instructor, who was a very high-level judo guy at the time, he was there too. And he said there was almost literally a fist fight of people wanting to get out there. One of the guys who came out was Gene LaBelle.
Sure.
Who had won the heavyweight championship that year at 190 pounds. Tohei Sensei was probably about 130, 140 maybe. So these guys started moving on him, and the judo guy said, "No, this is too easy. Make a circle." So they made a circle around him, and then the rule was the judo guy hit his hand on the table to start, and then he was going to hit his hand on the table to stop. So these guys tried to close the circle on him. He grabbed one of the guys and threw him into the middle of the circle and got out. And then he kind of had him more or less one at a time. And both Sig and Bob Smith, who actually wrote about this in his first book on judo called The Complete Book of Judo, said he completely dominated these 5 guys. And Tohei Sensei himself, Tommy LaBelle, tried to hurt him. And so he threw him a little harder and separated his shoulder. And I know you know who Gene LaBelle is.
Yeah, you know Gene LaBelle, sure. He's a famous stuntman, tough guy. You know, he's
one of the toughest guys of all time, probably.
Yeah, he's a tough guy.
And at this point, he was in his prime, having just won the heavyweight judo championship.
Right.
So to me, that was probably one of the greatest actually documented martial art performances I've ever heard of, because these guys were really out to make him look bad and to hurt him. And he had no idea this was coming. Probably would not have agreed to it if he had known. And anyway, going back to my experience with him, Tohei Sensei had done a lot of teaching of the police force in Honolulu. They actually made him an honorary captain of the Honolulu police. So he showed us a lot of techniques like that, and those are the ones I used to work with the military police in the Air Force.
Yeah. No, I was just going to say that one of my other connections was I was friends with Oscar Ratti.
I've got his book. I never met him.
Yeah, so I used to go to lunch with him once a month in New York City. I met him as kind of, you know who T.K. Lee is?
Yes.
Okay, so T.K. Lee, I studied Iaido in New York City with the New York Sword Club. John Pro was one of the instructors, and Martin Eisenberg, and it was Musa Shindenru Iaido. I eventually made Shodan under Mitsuzuka Takeshi in that, and so the one night I'm in class and TK Lee's there. He's doing sword with us, and I get introduced to him as a jiu-jitsu sensei, and I'm young. This is going back. I'm probably like, I want to say 28, 29, whatever I am, 30 years old. And TK Lee says, "What's that? What kind of jiu-jitsu you do?" I said, "I do Sosui Shitsu." And he goes, I don't think so. Right. And I said, okay, well,
That sounds like him, actually.
yeah, I know. I go, well, I don't really care what you think. I know what I do. And I do a serious Japanese Koru of jiu-jitsu. He goes, well, I'd like to come visit your school. He says, everybody's welcome to come visit the school. So he comes in and I'm showing him stuff. And I went to TK Lee's dojo twice to teach jiu-jitsu seminars to his Aikido guys. And then the one time he comes in back to New York and he calls me and he says, hey, Mike, it's TK. I said, hey, what's up? He goes, listen, can I come by the dojo tonight? You have jiu-jitsu, right? I said, yeah. He says, can I bring a friend? I says, yeah, bring whoever you want. And he walks in with this elderly gentleman who's got a pea cap on. And I come over and I say hi to Lee Sensei. And Lee Sensei says, Calandra Sensei, I'd like you to meet Oscar Ratty. And I look at the guy and I go, the Oscar Ratty? And he starts laughing. Oscar Ratty starts laughing and goes, well, I don't know if I'm the Oscar Ratty, but I am Oscar Ratty, right? So then I go, Secrets of the Samurai Oscar Ratty? And he goes, yep, that's me. And I was like, oh my God, right? So we do the jiu-jitsu class and Oscar sends me a letter afterwards, which I still have, telling me he couldn't believe he was seeing real jiu-jitsu in this Queens school. Right? He says, I hadn't seen real jiu-jitsu. I didn't think anybody was still practicing the ancient jiu-jitsu styles. And then he was nice enough. He did an illustration for me, which I still have hanging in my office here. And now I actually own one of his paintings. And we became friends. And I would go and eat lunch with the guy and just basically listen to him talk. And if you go on my channel, you see this video of him and Yamada Sensei at the World's Fair. And I got that video from Oscar. Oscar gave me that video. And again, so I've always had this kind of loose connection to Aikido through people I know, even though I technically have never trained in Aikido, right? Although the current headmaster of Aikido, Moriteru Ueshiba, he gave me a private tour of the Aikikai Hanbu in Japan.
Wow.
I had a group and a friend of mine, Yamada-san, who is a very big businessman in Japan, very wealthy, well-to-do. His son was my ward while he went to school here in the United States. So I was responsible for his son. So my wife got a pearl necklace as a gift for doing that. And when I went to Japan, he said, we're going to go to the Aikikai headquarters. You're going to, Moriteru Ueshiba, who's my boyhood friend, he's going to give you a personal tour. And I was like, all right. And sure enough, gave us the personal tour, me and my group. It was great. We spent a bunch of time there, asked him a lot of questions. It was just really good. I really enjoyed it. And then at the end, I'm getting ready to leave. And he says, Michael, he says, please, you must teach Aikido. You must teach Aikido. And I said, Sensei, if I do any more martial arts, my wife will kill me. I can't. I said, I'm already teaching 6 arts. If I teach anything more. So like I said, it's interesting that I've always had this kind of like loose connection to Aikido, and I have a lot of friends in the Aikido community. And yeah, I've even met the headmaster and, was given a personal tour of the headquarters by him, which needless to say, my students were in shock that here we are, So yeah, so go ahead. So continue with the Tohei stuff.
Well, that tour is more than I ever got from my visits to the Aikikai. So you're ahead of me.
I got to tell you, Bob, I say this all the time. I feel very blessed with the things I've been able to do because of the martial arts. Like,
I agree.
Yeah. Like I've been so lucky and I've gotten to do, some things that, a lot of Americans haven't gotten to do. So I've been so lucky and, it's been great. I mean, it's been a great ride so far and I'm just still enjoying it. So.
Could not agree with you more.
Yeah.
In fact, I got a nice thing from, we call Moriteru Doshu.
Right.
Is the title for the head of Aikido. I unexpectedly got a promotion from him to 7th Dan in January.
Oh, congratulations. Congratulations.
Thank you. Yeah, because when he took over, he eliminated the 9th and 10th Dan levels. So the only rank, the highest rank they're giving out now is 8th Dan.
Huh. That's interesting.
There's one 9th Dan still alive. His name is Hiroshi Tada Sensei. I think he's 94. And he's still out there whomping and stomping.
Do you know Endo Sensei?
Yes.
Is he still alive?
Yes.
So here's another Aikido story. I'm studying Jodo with Matsumoto Shigehiro, who also does Aikido, right? Had some problems with him. He's got some personality issues, so I couldn't stay there.
Never met him, so I don't know. Yeah.
Yeah. So I'm sitting there, and one of the 8th Dans that trained in the dojo says to me, Michael, come with us. We want you to sit and talk with Endo Sensei. I'm like, okay. So they take me in a separate room, and Endo Sensei sitting there. And I come in and I said, hi, Sensei, how you doing? I'm Mike. He says, oh, nice to meet you. He speaks English, right? And we sat there and had like an hour-long conversation about martial arts. And I didn't really know who he was, and then I found out afterwards he's this very senior Aikido sensei, Right. So again, another thing, I got to just sit and talk with the guy, which was a great conversation, really appreciate it. And then also, I do Katori Shinto under Sugino Yukihiro, and he's also a senior Dan in Aikido. So, I have all these loose connections, like I said, everywhere into the Aikido world, But so that's interesting. Did he ever give a reason why he eliminated the 9th and 10th Dan?
The reason he gave, as I understand it, was he didn't feel qualified to give those higher dans.
Interesting.
As you know, the Japanese have a very elliptical way of communicating things.
Yeah. Yes.
So if there's more to it than that, that information is above my pay grade.
Right. Yeah, I hear you.
Answer.
Yeah, I hear you. I know exactly where you're coming from in that. I mean, just talking to some of my sensei in Japan, sometimes getting a real answer out of them is like trying to pull teeth.
Well, they hate saying no to anything.
To anything. And, like I tell people, in 2019, I was one of the hosts for the Ishin World Karate Association Championships in Europe. And it was only the second time it was out of the United States. And so my sensei, Shimabuku Kichiro, came in for that. And the day the tournament was starting, he said to me, he says, Michael, can Lisa sit with me, my wife? He wanted my wife to sit with him up on the dais while the competition was going on. And I said, sure. So I said to my wife, I said, listen, he wants you to sit with him. She said, oh yeah, no problem. So she went up and sat next to him. And as soon as she sat down, he leaned into her and said, listen, I can't say no. So when people come up and they want pictures and they want this and they want that, I would appreciate it if you tell them no, that not right now. I'm not doing that right now. That the tournament's going on. I'm watching the tournament. And my wife is like, fine, no problem. I'll tell him. And that's what my wife did. So basically, she was his bodyguard for the weekend. And when she couldn't do it, one of my senior guys from New York sat up there next to him because he knew a bunch of those guys too, and they would sit there next to him and just make sure no one, And this is what a lot of Americans, and I'm sure you've come to realize this too, don't understand about the culture. So they'll ask a Japanese sensei a question, and they'll just go, okay, and they think that means they're agreeing with what they want to do, not realizing that, no, they're not agreeing with it. They're just going, okay, like, okay, all right, thanks for telling me. But they're not saying, oh, yeah, go ahead. You want to do that? Go ahead and do that. They don't understand that that's not what they're being told. And this has created a lot of problems because, again, Americans fall into this, idea that they've been given more authorization, let's say, of certain things when they really haven't. And that's why one of the things I try to educate, people on is you need to understand that when they say okay, it's not they're giving you the okay to do that. They're just saying, okay, you told me, right? So it's interesting that I didn't know that he did that. So that's kind of interesting. That's in a way he's trying to put the genie back in the bottle, right?
That's my guess. Yes.
Like even me, I was promoted to 10th Dan in
yeah, congratulations.
Oh yeah, thanks. Like I say,
that's a real 10th Dan promotion.
Well,
my friend in Kenpo that I used to share a school with, he told me there's 400 10th dans in Kenpo in the United States. I said, well, where did these ranks come from? He just shrugged his shoulders.
Right. It's the same in Ishinru. It's the same in Ishinru karate. There's a ton of 10th dans. This group promotes the guy. This group promotes the guy. So when I was I get promoted to 10th dan, and I'm like, for myself, I'm trying to like, well, what does it really mean? Well, first off, it means I'm around a long time, right? That's what it means, right? But when I went to Okinawa recently, people like Pat McCarthy and Scott Mertz and some of the other guys there who are not Ishinru guys, they don't do Ishinru. They said to me, well, you don't seem to understand, like, this is a big deal. Like, to us, it's a big deal because you're a Westerner and you've been promoted in the lineage. So they go, they said it goes Kion Sensei, Tatsuo Sensei, Kichiro Sensei, you. He says, even in Okinawa now, a lot of the 10th dans, they're not promoted within the lineage. They're promoted by boards. They're promoted by umbrella organizations. And, they said to me, like, no one can question your 10th dan because of the way it was bestowed upon you.
The and then that connection to the source.
Yeah. And then that kind of, it kind of was like, oh, okay. So I guess I'm not thinking it's a big deal, but now I'm beginning to realize how some people that are looking at it from the outside are thinking, wow, it's amazing that this kind of happened. And, so I mean, it is amazing, and I'm very appreciated, but I tell people, it doesn't really change my life in any way. Although I will say, all of a sudden, I seem to have more friends, in terms of which I always find kind of interesting, right? And then the other thing is, now all of a sudden, sometimes I think the things I say or do seem to become more important. Which, I was saying the same things for the last whatever. And now all of a sudden, so it's just funny how people perceive things, but, well, it's funny because with Aikido, like even Kishimaru Sensei was not expected to take over the style. Right. I mean, he had another brother who was, I think he was hurt.
Well, I'm not sure about that, but going back, this is a pretty long time now, into the pre-World War II era. O-Sensei, Ueshiba Sensei, had a very close friend, Hakuro Nakayama, who was a very well-known sword master.
Yeah.
And one of his top students, whose name was Kiyoshi Nakakura, who later became a ninth dan in Kendo.
Okay.
He adopted him into the Ueshiba family as his successor. He married one of his daughters and changed his name to Morihiro Ueshiba.
Okay.
And things didn't work out.
Okay.
In an interview that I read with him, he just said, well, I didn't feel like I could come up to Ueshiba Sensei's standards. But again, going back to the elliptical method of communication, I don't know exactly what happened,
right?
But he opted out, and so Kishimaru Sensei became the successor, which I think actually worked out better than it might have otherwise. Although, you can never figure out, well, what if this had happened instead of that? But
right.
My sense is that the way he put the art together and created somewhat of a system for training, because the founder was not into that kind of stuff at all. And the other thing that he did is he was very open to people doing Aikido in different ways, rather than trying to promote, say, you have to do it this way or you're out.
Right.
And because of that, the Aikikai is held together pretty well in comparison with some other martial art associations that haven't held together that well in Japan.
Right.
And his son is kind of carrying on that tradition in the sense of having a wide view of what Aikido could be. And so people didn't feel like they were being unduly pressured by the Japanese in Japan.
Well, it's interesting you say that because you look at a guy like Saito Sensei.
Right.
Who was teaching up in Iwama. And again, I got a hold of his video series early on when I was training in jiu-jitsu. And I'm doing jiu-jitsu over 40 years. And I was very impressed with how he moved. And I was very impressed with what he did, right? So, when you looked at him, he was up in Iwama, and he always stayed with the headquarters. And you looked at his Aikido, his Aikido had a different flavor, right? And again, why did it have a different flavor? We don't know. I mean, he's training with Ueshiba Sensei when Ueshiba Sensei is visiting Iwama, right? And
he had a house there. I mean, he lived there a good part of the time.
Right. So who knows? Maybe Ueshiba trained him a little different. I mean, we don't know. We weren't there, right? But again, I look at his Aikido, and another guy I'll mention is Mitsugi Sayotomi Sensei. Another guy with his Aikido is a little different. There's a different flavor to it. I think that is so much better. I think if everyone's a carbon copy, it's like not good. It's not good for the art. It's like
agree.
I was asked in Okinawa, a couple of these guys that don't do Isshinryu asked me, "You move differently," they said to me, "than all the other Isshinryu guys." And I said, well, I have a lot of different influences in my martial arts, but I'm also principle based. So I'm not one of these guys that says, well, the teacher says you have to do it exactly like this. And then I realize that doing it like that is hurting my body. Well, I'm not doing that. In other words, I'm going to realize that there's something that I've got to fix here. So I try to go by principles as opposed to like one of my favorite sayings now is principles versus personalities. The teacher that says you have to do it exactly like me, it has to be done exactly like me, I think doesn't get it, because again, I have my body, you have your body, he has his body. I've got to figure out for my body, not for your body. I don't have your body. And I think that's a big problem with certain teachers, that they get hung up on that instead of being a little bit more relaxed and letting the student figure it out a little bit on his own. And I think when the teacher does that, you see a growth in the student that it's pretty amazing. And I look at a guy like Saito Sensei, and I look at that and I say, wow, I wonder if he was in Tokyo, if he would have developed the same way.
It's an interesting question. In his particular case, one other specific thing that was different is, for reasons which people speculate about but nobody really knows, O-Sensei taught weapons in Iwama and he didn't in Tokyo. So Saito Sensei actually developed a whole curriculum of weapons with the Jo and the Bokken.
Right.
He actually had even a throwing thing that he developed with it was like I don't know if it really would count as a shuriken because it wasn't a star-shaped thing. It was a little long, pointed thing.
Okay.
And I don't know if he learned that from O-Sensei or developed it himself, but the Bokken and the Jo stuff he systematized. And it's probably, within the Aikido community, the most popular weapons curriculum around. There are some others, but it's probably the most popular. One experience I had which fully supports what you just said. The first time I went to Japan was in 1998. And so there were still some of the founders' students teaching at the headquarters.
Okay.
Unfortunately, as years have gone on, of course, there's none of them left.
Right.
And the thing that was impressive to me in watching all these different teachers is how different they were. It was almost like if you didn't know better, you'd say, are these guys doing the same art? And so I thought about that, and the conclusion I came to, which is sort of what you were just saying, I think the founder was very good at seeing what someone's natural arc of development was. And rather than trying to make them a carbon copy of him, he tried to move them along in what was a natural arc of development for them. One of my friends is a student of Sugawara Sensei, who also teaches Katori Shinto Ryu. In fact, he did the 3-volume book on Katori Shinto Ryu. He's a book publisher. He also published the 5-volume set of Saito Sensei's.
Okay.
And he was an uchideshi of O-Sensei's in the early 60s. And when he was finishing his time as an uchideshi, O-Sensei said to him, you should study a Koryu. That would be good for you. And so he went and studied Katori Shinto Ryu. Also studied Goju Ryu with a teacher in Okinawa.
Okay.
I forgot his name. He's the teacher that runs the Jundokan, or did until he passed away.
Eiichi Miyazato?
Yeah, that's right. He
Okay.
studied Goju Ryu with him. And he goes to China every year. Sugawara Sensei does, to study martial arts in China. He brings martial arts teachers from China to his dojo in Japan and has them teaching there. But Yao Sensei said to him, "Yeah, you should go study Koryu. This would be good for you." But that's not something he said to everybody.
Right.
Terry Dobson, who was one of the probably the only one of two uchideshis of O-sensei who was American or foreign, he was wanting to study Chinese martial arts with a teacher that Bob Smith studied with in Taiwan, Wang Shujin, taught Tai Chi, Bagua, and Xingyi.
Okay.
Then the other uchideshi, Japanese uchideshi, were telling him, "No, you can't do that. You just have to study Aikido." So Terry went to O-sensei. He said, "I'd like to do this." He said, "Fine, go ahead. You do it. That's your path."
Right. So my first instructor laid that on me. I was a full partner in a dojo with him and four other guys. And I was the only one studying other martial arts outside the school. And he became he started losing it, becoming crazy, controlling. And, he said, we've made a decision that if you train here, you can't train anywhere else. And I just laughed. And he goes, "Well, this isn't funny." I go, "This is very funny." I said, "Because I'm going to train wherever I want." I said, "You don't tell me where I train. I'm a grown man." I said, "I train wherever I want." And eventually I left. I left there. And it's funny because the first time I went to Okinawa and I sat down with Shimabuku Kichido Sensei, he said to me, "You should train with everybody you think is better than you. And you should make your own strong Isshinryu karate." And that advice was the greatest advice I was ever given in martial arts. And that was 1991. I started in 79. I met Kichido Sensei for the first time in 81 in New York, and I met him again in 85 in New York. So I already knew him before I went to Okinawa. But that advice was shocking to me because I'd come from an environment where I know everything you need to know. You don't have to train with anybody else. I can teach you everything. There's nothing anybody else knows that can show you. But now here, the shackles were taken off, and I'm told, go out and, I've trained in a lot of arts. I mean, in New York, I was teaching 6. I've trained in several Koru, some longer than others. Jodo, a long, long time. Katori now is going on 20 years. Sosui Shitsuru Jiu-Jitsu is over 40 years. So, the experiences from all those things is, of course, how could it not affect? They all affect each other, right? I mean, again, like people say to me, I get asked the question all the time, well, you teach all these arts. Do you teach them as a blend? And I say, no, I teach them as separate and distinct arts. But of course, there's overlap. We all have 2 arms and 2 legs. I mean, okay, how could there not be overlap? How the principles are universal. So if the principles are in the arts, funny thing about you're talking about Ueshiba Sensei. So I trained with a guy by the name of Bob Tayani, who was a very senior Goju Karate Sensei. Originally started in New York training Goju. Big sport karate guy. Fought Mike Stone, was in that era of sport karate. Traveled to Japan, lived in Japan, trained with Gogen the Cat Yamaguchi. Eventually went to Okinawa, was Toguchi Sensei's representative in Goju, and then eventually trained with Sosui Ishikawa, and got very into the Bubishi and the more, a little bit different approach to karate. And he once told me that he was at an event in Japan and Ueshiba Sensei walked into the room. And he said when he walked into the room felt different. That's what he said about Ueshiba Sensei. And he literally said, I think if my quote is correct, Tayani Sensei, who passed away almost a year ago now, said, the old man had it. Like you could feel it when he walked into a room. And, I found the one part of the book interesting when it's Nadeau, right? Is that how you pronounce his last name?
That's right.
Okay. So when Nadeau Sensei says he's sitting there, he'd ask the question and Ueshiba seemed to like the question. So he extended his arm to Nadeau so Nadeau could be his uke, right? And Nadeau says, I'd seen this old man barely touching people. I'm paraphrasing here, throwing them around. And I'm like, is this real? So when I hear that, I like that because he's questioning it. I think we need that, right? And he gets up and he says, I went to lock his arm. I tried to grab him and lock him hard. Like I was going to do it to him. And the next thing I know, I'm gone. And I don't even know what he did. And, one of the things that I actually had a brief conversation with Moritero about this. Moritero showed me some classes. And I don't know if it was because Yamada had told him my background in other arts, but the Aikido classes he took us to, they were doing a lot of atemi in the class. They'd strike, throw. They'd strike, do something else, right? And I commented to him. I said, Sensei, I just want to mention this. A lot of the Aikido I see in the States, they're not doing a lot of atemi. I said, now, it's not everyone, but a lot of the ones I see, it's always this flowing and there's no, and he said, yeah, and I said, it looks to me like they're all trying to imitate your father when your father was older. Right? But the problem is Ueshiba Sensei by that point was at a level that most people aren't going to get to. And and if you're only mimicking him, you're not going to get it. It's like my Taiji master. I tell this to other disciples. You're mimicking the master. You have to actually work on the principles and figure it out yourself. Don't mimic. Figure it out for yourself. So it's interesting where how I think because we have so much film of him when he's older, that's what people look at. But when you look at that pre-war film, and he's slamming those guys around, I mean,
sure,
yeah. So now you saw, okay, well, this is how he was training back then. Now, yeah, he's reached the level. Okay, you want to get to that level? You've got to go through that same kind of process. You've got to forge that body so you can do these techniques at that level later on. So you never met the founder?
No, I started when he was still alive, but I was actually planning on going to Japan with Nadeau Sensei for a trip to meet him, and that's when he had passed away. So no, I never got to meet him. No.
Yeah. I had the same situation. Ishinru I started in 79, so he had passed away in 75. And then in 97, I went to Okinawa. I met Gakiya Sensei and Mariyoshi Kobudo for the first time. Mariyoshi Sensei was supposed to be there. He was in the hospital. He never came out. He passed away on my birthday in 97, so I never got to meet him. So, again, these are, I guess you could call them regrets, but it's hard to, it's tough to have regrets, but, obviously I would have loved to meet both of them, but, it just wasn't in the cards.
Exactly. Yeah. Well, sort of continuing the story and along the lines we were just talking about, when Nadeau Sensei knew I was moving back to the East Coast, he said, if you get a chance to practice with Professor Zhenman Chang, you should do it.
Okay.
And I knew who he was.
Right.
I actually had a book that he and Bob Smith wrote together. So one of my Aikido students was studying with Bob Smith. He had a class in Bethesda, Maryland, outside of Washington. At the time, he was still working. He was still at the CIA, Bob Smith was. So I went over and started training in both Tai Chi, and Smith had also studied Bagua and Xingyi in Taiwan. And so he was teaching that, so I got to do some of that with him. But he took me up to New York along with some of the other students, so we got to meet Professor Chang and then got to train with him on a pretty regular basis. And so that was an amazing experience to work with someone who had achieved that level. The thing that was mind-boggling about Professor Chang wasn't just how good he was at Tai Chi, but if you go back to his life in China, in mainland China, in a country, give or take, of 1 billion people at the time, he was one of the most famous artists. Chiang Kai-shek, who was the president at the time, his wife was one of his painting students, actually wrote the introduction to one of his books on art. And I know as an artist, appreciate that. But he was also one of the most famous poets and calligraphers in China. There's a professor of poetry and calligraphy at a university in Beijing and a professor of art at another university in Beijing. Besides that, he was one of the most eminent doctors of traditional Chinese medicine. Started an organization between the world wars called the Chinese Medical Association. The goal was to try to keep Chinese medicine from losing too much ground to Western medicine at the time. And he taught Tai Chi at the Whampoa Military Academy, which is kind of like their version of West Point. And then after the war was over and the Civil War was over, along with hundreds of thousands of other people, he emigrated from mainland China to Taiwan. In Taiwan, he was kind of like a senator in the legislature, one of the authors of the Constitution in Taiwan. And he continued doing the other things he was doing, and he was kind of like the unofficial team doctor for the Olympic team in the years when Taiwan represented China in the Olympics. And then in 1964, the government there asked him to do a painting exhibition at the World's Fair in New York City.
Okay.
So when he was in New York, the Chinese community there asked him to stay in New York. So he spent the rest of his life going back and forth between Taiwan and New York. And that's where I got to practice with him through the good auspices of Bob Smith.
And just talk about Bob Smith a little bit, because again, I'm aware of him, right? I actually have one of his books right here.
Yes.
So did he have a connection to Draeger too?
Very much so.
Yeah.
He and Draeger were very close friends.
Yeah. So, I recently interviewed Hunter Chip Armstrong up here in
I saw that interview.
So, I've always felt a connection to Draeger, because when I started in martial arts as a 15-year-old, there weren't a lot of books. And the books that were out there were Oscar Ratty, Draeger. There were the Shotokan karate books, but I wasn't doing Shotokan karate. But the Draeger books on all the various arts and different things were, I read them all. I mean, I have them all in my collection here. And Smith is mentioned, and it's just interesting. And Smith's an interesting guy because he's a military guy, right?
Yeah, he was in the Marine Corps during World War II.
Right. And then again, like Draeger, decides to devote himself to martial arts and, trains with these different people. It's fascinating. All those early guys, they didn't just do one thing.
That's right.
They all did multiple arts. I talk about that. All the founders of arts, no matter who they are, studied multiple arts. And then when they founded their art, okay, but they had a very, very wide, varied background. And in Smith's case, judo, right?
That was his. Well, actually, when he was younger, he was involved in boxing and in amateur, professional wrestling, but not the entertainment version, the actual wrestling.
Right.
And then got involved in judo.
Okay.
And then when he was in Taiwan, he wrote a fascinating book about his time in Taiwan. Here's a copy of it here.
Okay.
And so he talks about all the different teachers he studied with there. And then he wrote a memoir toward the end of his life, which is also quite interesting. Here it is here.
Oh, I have that. I have that book too. Yeah, that's a great book.
But he was the CIA station chief in Taiwan.
Okay.
And that gave him access to a lot of people that even some Chinese people didn't have access to, because he had connections with both the military, the police force, and organized crime.
I was just going to say, and organized crime.
Right. So one of his teachers was a monkey boxer named Liao Chang. He had film of him. What this man could do with his body was unbelievable. He actually looked like a monkey moving around. And he owed the organized crime people, and I think he probably had some connection with organized crime, but those kind of things are kind of vague.
Right.
Anyway, he owed money, and so Smith paid the money off, And in recompense, he got a bunch of the different teachers together, and he got to film all these guys.
Wow.
One of the guys he filmed was a hitman for the Black Dragon Society, the Chinese mafia.
Okay.
And when you looked in this guy's eyes, it was you could see this guy was a no fooling kind
Right.
of guy. And Smith actually approached him, wanted him to teach him, and he wouldn't teach him. But he said it probably wasn't because he didn't want him to learn his arts. He studied, he did Manus boxing and drunken style. It was that he just didn't want anybody close to him for any reason, given what he did for a living.
Right.
So, but he eventually got to practice with Professor Chang in Taiwan, which was not an easy thing to do, and then continued obviously his relationship with him when he went to New York. But Smith himself was a very interesting man. He was very kind, very generous, but he had a very kind of quirky personality. He loved to tell stories. He had the craziest jokes and practical jokes he would play on people and that kind of thing. So it was just an awful lot of fun to be around, as well as being a very generous teacher.
Well, one of the things I find is the teachers that try to make it a little more fun are usually a little more successful. Like I'm all about real self-defense. I mean, I cannot be because of what I went through myself, right?
For sure.
But that's a very serious subject, so it can get a little overwhelming. So you got to kind of present the material in a way that's fun and make people laugh. This way, they're not caught up in all the seriousness of it all the time, And, a lot of the teachers I trained with were like that. They crack jokes, keep it light, train hard, but, make it fun, crack a joke, make people laugh, feel comfortable, make them relax a little bit. I think it's important. I mean,
Agreed. Smith got to the point in terms of having fun with things where he wrote a couple of books under a pseudonym of John Gilby.
Right.
That are complete phony stuff.
Right.
And one of them was called Secret Fighting Arts of the World.
Yeah, someone gave me a couple of those books. I have them in my collection too. Right.
One of them, which is a really interesting story, there's an element of truth in it, an element of truth. Smith was friends with another pretty well-known judo guy, John Blooming from Holland.
Oh, sure.
Who was a huge guy, really big guy.
Yeah.
He had done weightlifting with Don Draeger, so he was very, very fit and strong, but very good judo guy. Also, the senior foreign student of Masayama's.
Right, Kyokushinkai. Yep.
And he had been in the Dutch Royal Marines and spent almost 400 days in combat in the Korean War. So he was a really genuinely tough guy.
Right.
And Smith told me this story about him. Smith was on his way home from his stint in Taiwan, and he wanted to take his Sandan test at the Kodokan in judo. So he was there for a couple of months kind of getting his judo stuff back because he didn't do that much judo in Taiwan. And one day he and Blooming were walking into one of the upper floors at the Kodokan. I guess they have like a little dormitory spaces up there for people.
Yeah, they do. I've been in a Kodokan multiple times. Yeah.
So they're walking along, and Blooming, being Blooming, for no particular reason, aims a roundhouse kick at Smith's head. So Smith is ducking under, and he's about to punch Blooming in the groin. And Kyuzo Mifune, the great 10th Dan, and 2 9th Dans happen to walk around the corner and see this huge guy trying to kick Smith in the head. And they did what the Japanese always do when things aren't the way they're supposed to be. They pretend it's not happening.
Right.
So they kind of squeeze their way by them in this hallway. Well, the next day, Smith is taking his Sandan test, and the judging board is Kyuzo Mifune Sensei and these 2 9th Dans.
Okay.
And they really put him through his paces big time, much worse than they would have otherwise.
Right.
Smith felt like he had to get Blooming back. So one of his teachers from Taiwan, Wang Shujin, was in Japan teaching, and he invited him to do a demonstration at an officers' club at one of the military bases near Tokyo. And he invited all these people, including Blooming.
Okay.
So Wang is going through his various moves and stuff. And if you've ever seen him, he's not an impressive-looking guy.
Okay.
Incredibly overweight. One of my friends said he looked like a dancing egg.
Okay.
But his martial arts skill was very serious. So he's going through these moves, and Smith walks over to Blooming and says, "What do you think, John?" And Blooming says, "Really, Bob, I'm not that impressed." Well, he knew Blooming would say that. At least he was hoping.
Right.
So he walks over to Wang Shujin and he says, "Mr. Blooming would like to see something." And Wang knew what that meant.
Right.
So he walks up to Blooming and he puts his fingertips on Blooming's stomach. And this guy has the washboard stomach from weightlifting.
Right.
With no further wind up, he does a corkscrewing movement into Blooming's stomach. Blooming's eyes roll back in his head. He falls on the floor and he's vomiting. And Smith leans over and says, "Would you like to see anything else, John?" Well, that got written up in Secret Fighting Arts of the World as the Cantonese corkscrew.
Now I'm going to have to pull that book out and look at that thing.
There's a lot of outrageous stuff in there. One of the other funny things in it is the most outrageous story, at least in my opinion, in there, which has no basis in fact whatsoever, was called the Parisian Halotonic Attack, where this guy had somehow learned to do something so that his breath was so bad he could knock you down from a distance. And the thing Smith told me about that story was all the other stories in the book are things that John Gilby, a.k.a. Bob Smith, had seen himself.
Right.
But this particular thing was told to him by Don Draeger, who uses his name in the book.
Right.
The implication, Smith said, is that Draeger was even a bigger liar than Gilby. And I was at, you probably met Bill Chen, the Tai Chi teacher in New York.
I actually didn't meet him, but I do have a student that trained with him for a while. So
I was at his school with Smith when we went to New York once, and Bill Chen said, "Will anybody have any questions for Mr. Smith?" And so this one guy said, "Are you John Gilby?" And Smith looked at him. He said, "Well, some people think Gilby is a better writer than I am." That was his answer. It gives you some idea of his personality.
Right.
He's just a marvelous person.
Yeah, another guy I think that is a little bit overlooked. As time goes on, I think even like Draeger, Oscar Ratty, Smith, I think their contributions become a little bit hazy and overlooked. And I'm not, that does not make me happy. Oscar Ratty's book, Secrets of the Samurai, who he'd be the first one to tell you because he was all over me. He says, "You have to rewrite it, Mike. You have to rewrite it." I like, that's never happening. So I love you to death, Oscar, but it's not happening. He says, for what I had available to me, there's mistakes in the book. I said, "Oscar, there's mistakes in every book." I said, "The book's fantastic as it is. Don't worry about it." And the illustrations, oh my God. I mean,
fabulous.
Yeah, I mean, forget it. I listened to him, and the person that first introduced me to Chinese martial arts, which was a sensei by the name of Hoshino Minoru in Tokyo, introduced me to Qigong and Tai Chi. I listened to the two of them have a discussion on Ki, on what a Ki is, and and it was like listening to two rocket scientists. Like, I'm literally, one of my students is there. We're looking at each other like, Jesus, I've never heard the Ki talked about in this type of depth, So yeah, so I constantly try to bring Oscar up on a regular basis. When people hear I was, and I'll tell you a quick story that you'll probably find interesting. And I've never told this story before, but I was asked to be an expert witness in a homicide case that took place in the Bronx, where a martial artist karate guy killed a guy with one punch. And the guy he killed was, a guy that was on methadone that really wasn't a threat. So they charged him with, manslaughter, and it was a whole big trial. So they asked me to be an expert witness in terms of the martial arts. So first off, you have to be certified as an expert witness. So even though I was a police officer and I was brought up there within the NYPD, I had never been certified as an expert witness in martial arts. So I noticed when I get on the stand, the lawyer's sitting in front of me with the defendant next to him, and I look at the two books that are on. I can see the spine, and the one spine is Secrets of the Samurai, and the other spine is How to Speak Hebrew, because the other witness, the witness to the crime, was an Ethiopian Jew. So I saw what was going on. Oh, they're trying to influence me. Like, oh, look, see, my client reads Secrets of the Samurai. Like, he's like you. He wouldn't harm anybody. But again, unlike him, I wouldn't kill a guy like that. I'd put him in a joint lock, gain him in control, and we'd call it a day. So the circumstances were he intended to seriously hurt him, and he killed him. But anyway, he got off, but that's besides the point. But the lawyer says to me, well, you're a so-called expert on martial arts. And I said, well, I'm training in martial arts a long time. I have a varied background, whatever. And he goes, and the rule is never ask a question you don't know the answer to.
Right.
So he goes, well, are you familiar with the book Secrets of the Samurai? And I said, yes, I am. And he says, you've read it? I said, yes, I have. He says, well, how else are you, like, what other books? I said, well, just to mention about Secrets of the Samurai, I'm personal friends with the author, Oscar Ratti. I go out to lunch with him once a month here in New York City. And the guy just looks at me, right? So here it is, a murder trial, and Oscar comes up in the murder trial, right? The book comes up in the murder trial. And, obviously the lawyer stepped in it, right? So it's just funny, right? And I wound up, I have copies of the actual my testimony, and my being asked all these martial arts questions, and eventually the judge says I'm certifying him as an expert witness. So I'm in the pool of expert witnesses on martial arts. If someone, if there was a trial involving a martial arts guy and they wanted to reach out for an expert witness, I'm one of the guys that are in the pool. But I always found it funny that he picked that book. Right, he picked that book and thought he was going to catch me on it, So it's funny how these things inject into other areas that we don't expect them to pop up in,
Right. Speaking about that, other areas, I've learned a tremendous amount from listening to your podcast.
Oh, thanks.
And specifically, my real emphasis throughout my career, which is in martial arts, which this year I'm in my 59th year.
Okay.
Has been more in the area of spiritual growth and martial arts in daily life. But in listening to your podcast, and it's actually, I think, benefited my teaching in that I've started to mention more often than I ever did before some of the more physical applications, self-defense applications in Aikido techniques and in Tai Chi also. But most of my focus has always been in these two areas. And I think one of the things that helped me with that was Nadeau Sensei, as you've read from the part of the book, this was something that was very important to him from the time he was really a teenager, which is kind of unusual. He started out studying judo, and now we're going back to the early 1950s. And his first judo teacher was at the high school he went to. He'd been a paratrooper in World War II and was a black belt in judo. And then he started studying yoga and bodybuilding with a teacher named Walt Baptiste, who was the first yoga teacher in San Francisco.
Okay.
But was also one of the first Mr. Americas in bodybuilding. It's an interesting combination.
That is an interesting combination.
So Nadeau Sensei noticed, and this is something today we go like, well, of course, but again, this is the early 1950s. if he practiced yoga and meditation and then he went to judo class, his judo was better. And he thought, wow, this is something here. And that led him to various ways of trying to look at how mind, body, energy, and matter interact with each other. When he saw O-sensei, his first response to himself was, I'm not crazy. There actually is something going on here. And so that put him on kind of his lifelong quest to look at how spiritual development and also daily life applications work within the context of studying martial art like Aikido. He had been a pretty serious judo student before he went to Japan, studied at the Kodokan, also studied at the JKA in Japan. But once he really saw what was his passion in life, which was this intersection of matter and spirit or mind and body, then he pretty much devoted himself to Aikido after that. But he had probably 10 years plus of judo training, studied Kenpo karate with some teachers in California before he went to Japan, and then studied at the JKA for a while with the Shotokan people there, and got to train at the Kodokan, including with some of the better teachers there. And so that's really what affected me was this approach. And as you're well aware and have correctly talked about many times in your podcast, the people who think that this somehow gives them magical powers and abilities are fools. There may be some people like that. I think in some ways the founder of Aikido was like that. I found Professor Chang to be like that. But in my years in the martial arts, those people are unbelievably few and far between.
They're rare. They're rare and they're oddities. My Tai Chi master is the same thing.
There's a lot of people who claim that but can't actually produce.
Right.
I was in one of Professor Chang's classes once in New York, and he was talking about the benefits of Tai Chi practice as far as making your bones stronger. The kind of an alchemical process that heated and cooled the bone marrow. And this is 1970s New York, and you know better than I do what it was like there then.
Yeah. Yes.
It was a crazy time.
Yes.
So the school attracted a lot of crazy people in it, the Tai Chi school. It was in the Bowery. It was at 87 Bowery, where you had to walk over drunks laying on the sidewalk to get into the building.
Yep, 1970s New York.
Yeah. This one guy who was a pretty strong martial arts guy, had done some judo, karate, and some Aikido, and he expressed skepticism. So Professor Chang held his arm out, like this, and he said, okay, hit my arm as hard as you want.
Right.
And the guy came down on his arm. I mean, he came down like this, but he really hit that arm hard. As soon as he did, his hand began to swell up. You could see it. It was starting to go like this. The professor had to give him herbs to.
Right.
But people like that are few and far between. And they usually are not big show-offs either.
No. Yeah. One of the things, talk about spirituality and stuff. I think one of the things that I think in the modern dojo, not all, again, I don't want to paint with a wide brush, but especially the dojos which have been captured by these like marketing groups that, tell you, well, you want to run your classes like this, you want to do that. I think the moral component, which is all part of the spirituality component, gets kind of a little lost. And, I've always felt, and my first instructor, I felt severely lost his moral compass, right? And this is why I left. And when I went to Okinawa and Master Shimabuku had to talk with me, he knew my first instructor, and I never told him why I left. I just said, listen, I'm on my own. And he told me a bunch of things, and I knew what he was telling me. He was telling me, well, why did you leave him? right? Okay, don't be like that. Like, in other words, okay, now you have to lead by example. You have to, the dojo goes as the sensei goes. So if the sensei leads by example, the dojo will be good, you know? And one of the things I've always been told, like when a teacher comes in to do a seminar in my school, the first time, they always say to me at some point, wow, your students are really nice. Like, your students are really nice. And they train hard, they work hard. Physically, they're really good, right? Everybody says that. But to hear that they're nice always made me feel good because, again, that's that. It is spirituality. It's that they're not, like I like to say, my one of my favorite lines is, my number one rule in life is don't be an asshole, right? And, you know, I think in a lot of modern schools, it's become so much about competition. Or then you get the guys that all they talk about is harming another human. Okay, I understand that. I talk about that too. But then I also talk about why you have to harm another human, when you would have to harm another human. You know, plus there are repercussions. There could be repercussions if you harm another human. So I want people to think about it. I want people to understand. Yeah, if someone's trying to seriously harm you or a family member, you have to do what you have to do to stop them. But, you know, if a guy's drunk and just acting like an idiot, okay, you know, I don't think you have to poke him in the eye. Like, I don't think you have to punch him in the throat, right? And I think that's something that gets a little bit lost in a lot of the modern martial arts schools. They don't talk about the moral component, that idea of, you know, you have to have a strong moral compass when you're teaching these very dangerous arts. If you don't, then you're just an animal. You're just teaching, you know. And that's one of my problems. Like Pat McCarthy once said to me in my office, he said, "There's no art in mixed martial arts." He said, "It's you know, it's always just about winning. It's about winning the fight, but there's no art in it." And I think a lot of the arts we do, whether it be Aikido, I mean, even the ancient style of jiu-jitsu I teach, they have a list of, they call them the directions. And it's a list of moral things. And my teacher's mother was the mother of the 16th headmaster, the wife of the 15th headmaster, and the daughter of the 14th headmaster. And she sat down with her daughter, who spoke really good English, and asked me to explain to her what these directions meant. So I sat there and I explained them. And then when she felt I wasn't 100% clear, or maybe she wanted to add something to it, she added something to it. And then when we were finished, I said to her, I said, Mama-san, I said, but two of them I cannot follow. And she looked at me for a second. And I said, I'm a police officer. One of the ones says, if someone offends you by violent deeds or words, you must ignore it and walk away so we can have an everlasting peace. And I looked at her and I said, well, I can't do that. If someone's trying to do a violent deed, I have to stop them. I'm a police officer. And she goes, oh, no, chotamate, wait a minute. She goes, no, military and police are exempt from that. So I also found that to be interesting, that because society's protectors are law enforcement and the military, that some of these moral codes that some of these arts have, we're exempt from that, because we don't have the luxury of, when the guy's committing a violent act on someone, to just turn our back and walk away. We have to go and we have to help that person. We have to stop that violent act. So again, I think it would be a good idea for a lot of modern martial arts instructors. And again, I'm not talking about bringing religion into the dojo, because I think that can create a whole other set of problems within the dojo culture. But the idea of spirituality, a strong moral compass, laying down rules, talking to the students about certain things you shouldn't do, correcting certain behaviors that you see someone doing in a dojo. I mean, we have a saying, obviously the New York school has been there for 40 years and it's still going, even though I'm out in Arizona now. And, you know, one of the things I told the person who took over my school was, just remember, a lot of times there's addition by subtraction. And he said, yeah, I know. I said, yeah. A guy leaves the school, or I ask the guy to leave the school because I don't like the way he acts, and the school gets better. I said, because again, that negativity, that poor moral guy, that guy who's got a dark spirit, right? If you want to put it that way, you don't realize he's having an effect on the school, and it's not a good effect. So get rid of him, kick him out.
Disturbs the Wa.
Yeah. And I couldn't tell you, look, I'm teaching 40 something years now. And there's been plenty of times where I just told people, listen, I don't want you to train here anymore. Go someplace else. And it's never not worked out for the better. It's never not worked out for the better. So, but I also think a lot
notice things like that.
Yeah. And the other thing I think instructors worry about it because they're like, well, that's a monthly due, the dues that I'm losing. And I get it. When you have a storefront, have a real martial arts school, a professional martial arts school, you're worried about paying your bills. So I get that. But I've discovered after years that you actually wind up getting more people because that guy was actually making people maybe not join the school, or maybe making other people quit. Right. So yeah, it's the spiritual component of it, I think, is often overlooked. And I think the really good masters that teach, I think they're all deeply spiritual people, whatever your definition of spirituality is,
Well, hearing you talk about Shimabuko Sensei in Okinawa, that comes across very, very strongly.
Yeah. Yeah. And again, go ahead.
Oh, go ahead.
No, you go ahead.
I was just going to say, trying to look at O-Sensei's life and teaching, which I've spent a good part of my life trying to understand, with limited results, of course.
Right.
There's nobody in Aikido at his level, but there's plenty of people who are better than I am, but nobody at his level.
Right.
Anyway, to me, he accomplished three great things. The first thing he accomplished is he gained through both his martial arts training and his spiritual training, because he trained with a spiritual master named Onisaburo Deguchi
right.
in Japan. He gained a deep understanding of how the universe itself works. And the second thing he did is he embodied that understanding through his Aikido. And the third thing he did is he left it as a path for us to follow. Even though we're not close to his level, we continue to try to follow the path as best as we can and pass it along to other students, but other people. But he just had this incredible depth. And what I've tried to do with the Aikido in that area is to help the students experience some of those things, looking at the art, not just as an art of martial art, but as an art of interpersonal interaction. And in some cases, the students aren't necessarily, they go from one level to another. Not that even that their self-defense skills are improving, but just within the context of how they're doing movements and how they're relating to their partner, they improve, they get better.
Right.
And I've found a lot of cases where even where the students' self-defense skills certainly wouldn't be up to the kind of standards that you talk about, but they come back to me and say that their interactions at home with their family or work with coworkers, things like that, dramatically improve. I had one student who was a computer guy, very, very smart guy. And he told me at work one day, after he'd been training for a while, one of his colleagues said, something different about you. He said, you were always a rather difficult person to deal with, and you've become better. And he didn't notice the change himself until somebody brought it up. And then he stopped training for a while, and then he came back after a few months or whatever. I said, it's good to see you. He said, yeah, my wife told me I had to come back to training. Sometimes other people see things that are changing in you, even that you don't see.
Right.
But it's helpful to get that feedback.
Yeah. Yeah. I often say that, I tell, most of my students are civilians, right? So I tell them, You train in martial arts, and maybe one time in your life you need it to save yourself or to save someone else. Maybe. And then hopefully that never happens. Hopefully you never have to use it. Hopefully you never have to experience what violence is like. I said, but if you have to, I hopefully am going to prepare you a little bit. And I have had people that I trained like 20 years, 25 years ago, all of a sudden reach out with an email. Sensei, I haven't spoken to you in 20 years. I was attacked 2 weeks ago. And it was like I never stopped training. The stuff you taught me helped me and, might have saved my life. And I'm like, great. Makes me feel very good, right?
Fantastic.
But then the other thing is I have a lot of kids that start with me when they're 4 or 5, and then they leave when they're 17 to go off to college. And all those kids are extremely successful. And that to me is just as important as the ones that survive some type of self-defense situation. And, I tell people all the time, there's a lot of benefits from martial arts, obviously health, fitness, the relationships you develop. I mean, I've had several people get married out of my dojo, right? So I think when you only emphasize one area, whether that be self-defense, or you only emphasize the spiritual side, or you only emphasize the fitness side, I think you're limiting what martial arts are. I really think you need to have a well-rounded approach and try to bring everything into it. And I think when you do that, you'll have a much more successful dojo. And I think the training's more interesting. And again, that's just my opinion, but I think that's a really good approach,
Well, you laid that out very nicely in your recent podcast on balance.
Oh, thanks.
You were talking about it, in terms of running a dojo and everything, but while there's a lot of things, as you said, going on behind the scenes in the dojo that if you're running it, you have to do, it's a big commitment for people who are working and have a family to come and train several times a week for decades.
Right.
And so they have to find that balance as well.
Right. Yeah.
But the thing that keeps me going at this point in my life is trying to get as close to that depth that people like O-Sensei and Professor Chang did, and then try and share that with people as best as I can. Professor Chang used to say that the ultimate goal of Taiji was to be able to treat people with human-heartedness, which is a phrase from Confucius, even when they don't treat you that way.
Right.
But he also said, inevitably, sometimes you're going to fail. And when you do, you have to have the internal strength which comes from your training to kind of embrace that experience and learn from it so you can do better the next time. And he really exemplified that. And although I never met O-Sensei, I believe he did too.
Yeah, I say all the time that I want to be better today than I was tomorrow. I want to be better tomorrow than I am today. And I'm trying to improve. When I say I'm trying to improve, I'm not just trying to improve my martial arts skill. I'm trying to improve me overall, right? And again, I make mistakes. Like, we're all human. We do things. We realize, that wasn't a good move, or I shouldn't have said that, or whatever. But I think a lot of people that do what we do, they hit a point, and then that progression stops, and they become content with where they're at. And again, I think once that happens, it's a tremendous problem.
Yes.
So, I just got back from teaching in New York, and there's people there that train with me almost for 40 years, 30 years, 25 years. They've said to me in the last few years, they say, we don't know what it is, but you're presenting the material a little bit different. And I said to them, well, I think part of it is, I started doing this silly podcast that I do, and I'm interacting and talking with people. And then I'm doing a lot of Zoom classes where I have to convey information in a different medium, right? I mean, you're not standing here with me. I'm trying to get you to understand something through a video medium. So I think my verbal skills hopefully are improving, right? Like Pat McCarthy was giving me a hard time recently, saying I'm saying too much. You're saying too much. And then I hear it, and he's right. I tell him, Sensei, you're right. I'm working on it, right? So I'm trying to get better at these things, but it is true. As we get older, I mean, the priorities change a little bit. Like for me, obviously, fitness is important. My health is important. It's not like I'm out there fighting like I used to fight when I was a police officer. And it's the teaching the hopefully next generations and future generations of martial artists, and then reaching people now through this medium, right? Which is something I never thought was going to be part of my life, right? I'm glad you reached out for me, because it was you that reached out for me. So I'm very glad you did. I really enjoyed our conversation. This was great. Maybe we'll do it again in the future. All right. So I really appreciate you coming on.
Thank you very much for having me, and I gained tremendous benefit from your podcasts and really, really enjoy them.
Thanks. I appreciate it. So take care.
Thank you. You too.
Well, I hope you enjoyed my interview with Bob Noha Sensei. I really enjoyed talking to him. All right. I want to give a little plug to his book again. All right. On Robert Nadeau. Very interesting book. Very interesting man. Really good book. I mean, look, I don't do Aikido, and I found the guy's story fascinating. So, and same with Noha Sensei. I mean, a lot of things he had to say. It was a great interview. I really enjoyed talking to him. I hope you enjoyed it. Please like, share, subscribe. All right. And let's keep this going, this experiment going with this podcast. And I'll see you guys in the next one. Thanks. Take care.